Now, welcome back. South Africa's opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, is taking a cabinet perks bill to Parliament to address what it terms exorbitant perks enjoyed by members of the executive. Now, the official opposition held a picket outside the state residence in Pretoria to highlight its challenge of the ministerial handbook. Yesterday, party leaders and supporters picketed outside the Bryntirion Estate, which is the ministerial estate in Tshwane, and this against what they termed rockstar ministers. Now, the DA has been vocal about the whopping 1 billion rand that is spent on state-owned residences occupied by ministers and deputy ministers. So for more on this, we're joined by the DA Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration, Dr. Leon Schreiber. And Dr. Schreiber, good to have you back with us. We started this conversation last week, so good to continue on this. Welcome to Morning Live once more.
Great to be here again. Thank you.
So let's just start once again by just restating the cost of the executive bill to taxpayers in South Africa. How much are we actually paying for all of these perks?
Yeah, so that is sort of the million-dollar question, to use a pun. It's something that I can't give you the exact number on yet because we are still waiting for a number of questions, answers to come to parliamentary questions on different aspects of the costs. But what we do know so far is a number of things. So there's the value of the properties that you mentioned. This is only the ministerial houses. It doesn't include the president's residences, etc. That's about R1 billion. Then we have 387 million rand per year that's being spent on staff, very big staff officers, and in some cases, ministers who are even exceeding the number of staff that they are allowed to employ. Then we have, of course, VIP security, which is about 600 million rand per year for the cabinet, for the ministers and deputy ministers. We have free water and electricity that's adding about another 8 million. We also have the generators that were purchased, 2.6 million rand. And so if you start adding all of this up, it starts becoming a very high bill every year. But as I say, we are still waiting for a number of elements that are outstanding. These are things like international trips. We've recently got a reply that Minister Patricia de Lille, for example, spent 2.6 million rand on international trips and business class flight tickets since taking office. So this number is yet to grow. I would say watch the space.
Indeed, we are. But in February, your party also asked the Office of the Public Protector to investigate this luxurious living of ministers. Where is that process currently, Dr. Schreiber?
Yes, so I think one of your commenters, I think it was Boyson, really nailed this issue because this is not even only about the perks, it is about the ministerial handbook in its entirety. We were not able to find any law that actually regulates this handbook or even really provides for it to exist. And that is the complaint that we took to the Public Protector. We have received a number of updates in the months in between, including a comment that this is really an unprecedented complaint. But what we haven't yet received is a status update. So unfortunately, it seems like things are moving quite slowly. As you say, this was back in October already. So we would really call upon the Public Protector to accelerate this particular investigation because the implications could be profound. If for 30 years taxpayers have been paying for things, and you heard the numbers there, billions of rands a year, that may be illegal, that is certainly something that should be prioritized so that we can get an answer on this particular matter from the Public Protector.
So let's just break it down now, Dr. Schreiber. What exactly are we talking about in terms of the exact perks that you believe that Cabinet can do without?
Yes, again, I think Boyson got it right. He said that there are some tools of trade that are obviously necessary, and where there are security threats, for example, that is something that I think we should take seriously. So I think that there are a number of things. VIP security would be right at the top of the list of massive expenditures. Also the staff components, really, you're talking about 11 people serving every need of a minister. In some cases, some of them violate it. People like Gwede Mantashe employ 17 people. I think these are all things that can obviously be trimmed. But I think the bigger point to make is that this discussion about how we are going to rein this in has never been had in Parliament because the ministerial handbook does not have a law that regulates it and is not required to actually go to Parliament. And that makes it, I think, a really dangerous anomaly in our constitutional democracy, because you will know that any decision about expenditure, whether it is salaries for ministers or for public servants or anything else contained in the budget, must actually be approved by Parliament. We have one glaring exception here, and that is the ministerial handbook. And so the discussion around cutting it really belongs in Parliament, so that we can find a way to provide, yes, when there are things like credible threats, security, and we're not being unreasonable on that, but at the same time asking the question, in the current economic environment, what are some of the changes that need to be made?
So why hasn't Parliament, been seized with discussing this particular ministerial handbook and also, its status and how it ought to be regulated before this?
Well, I really think in some sense that's a question for the Speaker to also answer on this, because it is something that has just existed sort of in its own universe. You may recall a few years ago, I'm going back a bit far now, sort of to the 2000s here, there was a period when the handbook itself was classified. It was a confidential document, and it was even impossible to find out what was inside. And that was a battle that the DA waged at the time. Now, at least, we have a situation where if you ask the president for the handbook, he is obliged to give it to you. But what we still don't have is a system that actually demands from the president to indicate to us how much certain things are going to cost and what the trade-offs are that he's made and why certain benefits are appropriate or not. There's no justification that's forthcoming, and that's really what we're seeking to address through the Cut Cabinet Perks Bill. We want to bring this thing into Parliament where it rightfully belongs.
Yeah, because there's just too much about it that just doesn't make any sort of sense. Because when we talk about, for example, the increases in some of these perks as per the ministerial handbook, who decides on that then? And how does that actually come into being, into law, such that it is applied if Parliament doesn't have sight of this?
It might sound fantastical, but it really is just the discretion of the president. If the president tomorrow, to use an example here, says that every minister should have an airplane, he can write that into the handbook, and that would be the end of the matter. Then the Department of Public Works goes out and purchases the airplanes. That is how a dictatorship operates, to be very frank. It's not how a constitutional democracy functions. So at the moment, all of the power over this is in the hands of the president. We are starting to get a picture now of how much it's costing. It's certainly not a small issue. It's something that's costing us billions every year. And that is why, really, this cannot be allowed to stand. And frankly, I think the president's silence on this matter is becoming concerning, because the question you've just asked, the answer is the president. And for him to just evade this issue and sort of try to downplay it and say he's going to review it, that's not the right answer. The right answer is, if this thing is illegal, then it must be fixed, and it must have the proper oversight that we have for any other money bill or expenditure in our constitutional democracy.
So while we're at it, and I appreciate that, you eat an elephant, I suppose, one bite at a time, Dr. Schreiber. But whilst we're at it, here you have the ministerial handbook that has been hugely problematic. And you're quite right. I remember the days when one was struggling to just get a copy of that ministerial handbook to see what the provisions were that were contained therein. So we have come a far way since then. But whilst we add it, if you think about the fact that deputy ministers, for example, are not members of cabinet, so you have a deputy minister who comes with all of these perks, but yet if a cabinet minister is not available, the deputy can't even step up to act in their place, in their position. So what is the point of having deputy ministers?
It is a very important question. And, if you put together the number of deputy ministers, which are now 36, with the number of ministers, then it brings you to 66 people who are currently benefiting from the ministerial handbook. So you're more than doubling, essentially, the expenses, because, as you say, essentially all of the perks that a minister is entitled to, a deputy minister also receives, but apparently without any of the responsibility or the job requirements. So they've obviously written, and this is the convention that's been used by multiple presidents, they've written the ministerial handbook to actually not be ministerial. It's called the Guide for Members of the Executive. So they've broadly defined it to also bring into the equation deputy ministers. Now, again, I think there's a reasonable way in which one could say, look, if a deputy minister has to travel to Cape Town, then, a flight ticket is probably required. Or a rental subsidy perhaps for accommodation for those 3 nights or whatever the case may be. But to then expand it to say, there's the house is included, the free utilities are included, the VIP protection, all of that is also included. It just doesn't make sense if you look at the responsibilities. I would challenge anyone to point to one thing that has been done by a deputy minister in the last 10 years that has been of some value and effect. And I don't think you'd come up with one example.
Well, there's a lot of it that doesn't make sense. For example, why should we have to pay for your spouses and your children's travel? SABC is not going to pay for my spouse or my children to travel with me if I have to work. Why should we pay for your travel post your tenure after you've stopped and stepped out of office? All of that doesn't make sense. What equally doesn't make sense to me is the fact that we have all the MECs as well. That provincial layer of government to me doesn't make sense, because effectively you're appointing another minister after the national minister to act in another sphere, because it's not like people are coming up with new policy at the provincial level. It is still national policy that is being implemented. So what is the point of having that sphere of government?
Well, I think that first of all takes it a little bit out of the specifics of the ministerial handbook.
Yes, which I did say we were going to look at, maybe more broadly.
Yeah. So my view on that actually is to say that rather than saying the provinces shouldn't exist, we should actually make sure that the provinces have the powers and functions to actually innovate and set their own policy directions. So you will know that in the Western Cape, for example, there's a big push around the devolution of policing. And, it's called the LEAP program that has massively expanded the number of law enforcement officers. That is certainly a very substantial new program, if you want to put it that way, that is now being directed by the province. We need the same, however, when it comes, for example, to public transport and, of course, the electricity crisis that we're facing. There's a role to play for provinces also in actually stepping up to the plate. So that's where the whole devolution conversation, I think, comes in, because if you say we're not getting value for money out of the provincial sphere, then we better make sure that there are powers and functions actually that compel those provinces and empower them also to step up to the plate and help solve problems. Because at the moment, even if you want to step up and help with something like policing, for example, you're going to run into a brick wall where the government will tell you, but this is a national function and Bheki clearly has the final say.
Well, I think we need to open up this discussion and bring more voices in. But thank you so much, DA Shadow Minister of Public Service and Administration, Dr. Leon Schreiber, speaking to us about the party's decision to challenge the ministerial handbook through a cut cabinet perks bill in Parliament.